welcome to this conversation with Tony Wheeler. I wanted to start by presenting Tony in a general way, and maybe chatting a little bit about Lonely Planet in the early days and your approach to travel writing, and then we'll move into the presentation of Tony's new book, Dark Lands, in italiano Fuori Rotta, che è uscito in italiano questi giorni da poco, da pochissimo. And then we'll, I'll open up. I'll try and leave at least 10 minutes at the end to open up for questions if you have any questions. Okay. And I want to bring you in, Tony, as much as possible. I don't want to sort of talk for hours. So even at the beginning, let's make it back and forth. Tony Wheeler is probably best known for as the founder, the co-founder with his wife Maureen of the travel guides, the Lonely Planet travel guide series. Which began in the early 70s, following a trip across overland from London, in the end to Australia, I suppose, which was supposed to be a gap year at the beginning.
It was, yeah. It was 1 year off, which somehow stretched to 40 years.
I did exactly the same, actually, when I arrived in Italy in 1984. It was supposed to be a 6-month holiday, and 30 years later, here we are. You actually had a background of traveling even in your childhood and when you were growing up, didn't you? Because your dad worked for an airline?
Yeah, my father was working for what at that time was BOAC, later became British Airways. And as a result, I did my early schooling in Pakistan and the Bahamas, and then high school, I did all of it in America. So I didn't, although I was born in Britain, I didn't really live in Britain until I was 16. And that might have given me an enthusiasm for travel. On the other hand, I had a younger brother and a younger sister, and it didn't give them an enthusiasm for travel at all. Maybe it put them off it.
When you set out on that trip in 1972 across, it was, I suppose, the classic hippie trail, wasn't it, at the time? Although maybe it was more of an extreme version of it, because the hippie trail often got bogged down somewhere in Turkey, and then you got the magic bus back to London. But did you have any idea that would turn into what has become a 40-year
trip? No, well, of course, we didn't call it the hippie trail in those days. I think it was only really called the hippie trail afterwards. And there's more to be written and, photographs to be searched out and so on, because it was a very colorful period. We called it the Asia Overland trip at the time, the idea of getting to Asia without taking a flight anywhere. But we had no idea it was going to turn into what it did. No, it was a complete surprise to us. And that first Lonely Planet book was not anything that was planned in any way at all. It just happened.
But did you was there a certain point of the trip when you started taking notes, thinking?
I'd sort of been taking notes from the very start. And, you did a lot of, because there weren't all the guidebooks in those days, there was a lot of note swapping between other people you met. So you met someone coming the other way, and you were just about to cross from Turkey into Iran, and they'd just come from Tehran to Tabriz to Turkey, and you were telling them where you'd stayed, and they were telling you where they had stayed.
It was kind of the equivalent at the time of a social network, wasn't it?
It was very much social network.
Sort of TripAdvisor on the road.
Yeah, except we didn't have any computers or phones or credit cards or anything else that we have today.
I think it's maybe younger generations may fail to grasp just what a revolution guidebooks like Lonely Planet were when they came in, because if at the time, the guidebook market had been dominated for over a century, in fact, by very traditional guides like Baedeker's and the Blue Guides, and the kind of
Michelin
guide,
as well.
Michelin, the kind of guide either that tells you how many rooms this hotel has, and and gives stars to restaurants, or the kind of guide that tells you what painting you can see in the third altar on the left. I mean, Lonely Planet wasn't the very first. I mean, Let's Go guides, the Harvard University student guide, started in the early 60s, and I suppose one of the very first of this kind of guide was the South America Handbook, which goes right back to the 20s. And
yeah,
although
so there were things, and I remember years later when we did our first India guide, and a book I had was called Murray's Handbook to India, which had come out, first of all, in 1890 or something, in 3 volumes. It was 3 big books. And then it had been out of print, and the new edition came out every 20 years. So it wasn't exactly kept up to date. And it was a wonderful book to travel around India with, because it was so old-fashioned. It was sort of, you get to the hotel, and the first thing you ask is, get your servant to unpack the trunks. And I always feel that the first thing you should do when you get to a hotel, once you've got your room, is to unpack your trunk. What else does one do?
Of course. And in fact, one of the very first editions of the South America Handbook, one of the pieces of advice there was pack a good saddle and a set of starched collars.
Well, so I think the South American Handbook used to recommend which countries in South America it was a good idea to carry your pistol. Arms are necessary in this country, but it's okay in that one. You don't need to be armed.
Well, maybe a good piece of advice today as well in some countries.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about, there's an ongoing debate, and as a travel writer, I think often it can be a rather what's the word? A rather artificial debate about guidebooks and the way they can ruin the places that they write about by bringing people into these beautiful, untouched paradises and sort of. What's your answer to that?
Well, I've been asked this question quite often.
Me too.
Yeah. Bali was beautiful until you did a guidebook to it, and look what's happened to it now. As if I built the airport and I bought the Airbuses and the Boeing whatevers, and I made all those hotels down the beach. It's all my fault. It wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done this. And I remember I did a slideshow once at one, and I ran a series of pictures of places I'd ruined. There's Bali, I've ruined that, and Cambodia, I've ruined that, and Vietnam, I've ruined that, and Phuket and Thailand. And Lonely Planet had just done a guidebook to Afghanistan. So I had a picture of, Kabul, and I said, look, very soon people are going to be saying, you ruined Afghanistan. Afghanistan was fine until you did a guidebook to it. Well, quite frankly, I'd like to have ruined Afghanistan. I would be very, very pleased if I could ruin Afghanistan.
There were people who were better at ruining Afghanistan than you, I think.
Yeah, I wasn't competition, I'm afraid.
But let's turn that into a more sort of turn the question on its side, if you like. Do you think, however, that said, that guidebooks have a responsibility to the territories that they write about as well as to their readers?
100%. And I think, tourists, we come in all sorts of different angles. And I think the tourists you meet in some places are very different from the tourists you meet in others. That some tourists are going there just to lie on the beach and get a suntan and drink lots of beer and party at night, and others are going there, I'm sure in Perugia, to go around the galleries and museums and churches and study the architecture. And I think one of the things the guidebooks should do is to encourage people it's a learning process, to learn something and to appreciate something about what you're doing. And if you do still want to lie on the beach, do that. I think cruise ships are wonderful things because it just takes a lot of people and puts them on that boat and they sail away somewhere, and it's less crowded when you get to the town.
Exactly.
They're all on the boats.
And And there's an ongoing debate, not just about guidebooks, but about tourism in general, and the way that it can, for example, support repressive regimes. I mean, I suppose the most famous example of this, or the one possibly that got the most press, was Burma in 1996, when...
Yeah, we had a lot of bad publicity for Lonely Planet about Burma. And the curious thing, though, was we'd done a guidebook to Burma in the late 70s. So we'd been doing Burma for a long time before anybody noticed or thought anything about it at all. It was only really when Aung San Suu Kyi was put under house arrest that suddenly Burma became a cause célèbre.
Well, it was because Aung San Suu Kyi actually said, "Don't come to Burma."
Perhaps. Nobody really knows. And it was, I mean, my feeling at the time was that we knew lots of Burmese people who were saying, "Please come. You know, if you don't come, we don't feed our kids because our job is..." And tourism, of course, at that time in Burma was very small. It's multiples larger now, but still smaller than other parts in Southeast Asia. And, you know, the tourists were a contact, were a source of information from the outside world. So I never felt that tourists shouldn't have gone to Burma, although we always said, you know, it's your own decision. Here are the facts. Aung San Suu Kyi may have said, "Don't come to Burma." And if you feel that by going there you support the government, then don't go.
Sure. I mean, there are two quite interesting examples of this in your book, your new book, Furirota, Dark Lands. One is, the two examples I'm thinking of, one is Haiti after the earthquake and the controversy about cruise ships docking there. And the other one is Zimbabwe and safari tourism and the way that even wildlife can be affected by...
Absolutely.
Talk me through both of them.
Well, let's go backwards. The Zimbabwe, which, you know, was a sort of shining light in Africa for a while, and it's remarkable how far off the track Zimbabwe went. And I put Zimbabwe in that book because it was an example of a country which had gone off the line, off the tracks. And I'd been there several times before it had all started to go wrong. And it was really interesting going back. And I went back to one particular smaller national park where everything had shut down. There was a very nice lodge there which I'd stayed in. And it was still there, and the guy who ran it was still running it, but he had 1 or 2 guests a year. It wasn't, you know, how many people were staying that night. And all the camps in the park had closed down, and because there were no tourists there and no safari guides there and so on, and because the villagers were no longer getting the spin-off from this, you know, how do you feed yourself? Well, you go out and you shoot something. And, you know, it had devastated the wildlife in this particular park. And so the disappearance of tourism had a huge effect on, not just on the local population and the people who survive from tourism, but also on the wildlife. And I think wildlife is a particularly good example of where tourism can have a positive effect. The only reason that we have we lose so many elephants to poaching and ivory going to China and so on, but the only reason they are protected to some extent is that tourists like to see them. And they like to see them, and therefore the local people protect them. Otherwise, an elephant is just something that wrecks your farm and comes in and pulls up the crops.
Sure.
So, you know, Zimbabwe was an interesting example of it. And curiously, a place that is coming back. The tourism is beginning to rebound, despite the fact that Mugabe is still in power.
And again, exactly, I mean, you often hear the argument, oh, if you visit Zimbabwe, you're just supporting a repressive regime. Robert Mugabe is a vile dictator who...
Which he is, but he's making his money off diamonds and, you know, mining and so on. He's not making it off tourism. He's not, you know, getting a percentage from every safari guide or local accommodation and so on.
Sure,
so,
and if, you know, the more Zimbabwe opens up to the world, the more contact they have with people from all over the world, the more they get, you know, hopefully they're going to, you know, create networks. You know, that,
so I'm all for tourism in Zimbabwe. And Haiti was a very interesting country to go to. As Everyone, the thing everyone says about Haiti is it's had this disastrous history. You've had Papa Doc and Baby Doc. It's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It would be down there in sort of middle rankings of countries in Africa. But in the Western Hemisphere, it's the poorest country. And it just looks like a disaster zone. But some of this, of course, goes right back to the very beginning. It was a heroic country. They rose up against the French when it was a colony. They kicked the French out. They were a successful slave revolt. And how much thanks did they get for it? None at all. I mean, did the Americans who just had their revolution, did they come in and support Haiti? No way. They had their own slaves. They didn't want to give their slaves the idea they could rise up and overthrow the slave masters. So poor Haiti was isolated from the very start. And then it had this series of bad governments, and I was there in a year or so before the big earthquake. And of course, having been hit by everything else, it's then hit by this earthquake. And there are even though Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton had their honeymoon in Haiti, there are very few tourists there today. And when I was there, after the earthquake, one little sort of piece of tourism they had is one particular cruise ship out of Miami stops there every week. But it doesn't stop there and go to any of the tourist attractions, including really the best fortress or castle anywhere in the Caribbean, which the slaves who'd kicked the French out built. So it's an amazing place to see. They just go to this beach because it's just too difficult. The roads are too bad and the politics are difficult. And the apocryphal, possibly, story is that the people on this cruise ship don't even know they've been to Haiti. They're told that we're going to land on Paradise Island today, and we're going to have a day on the beach at Paradise Island. And they get off the boat, and they go swimming, and they lie on the beach, and they do all the things you do, and never realize they've been to Haiti. And then after the earthquake, there were some do-gooders saying, oh, the cruise ships shouldn't go there. It's making fun of the place. They've had this disaster. Tell the cruise ships to stop going. And I was thinking, there's the one little bit of income coming in. To say stop to that is just ridiculous.
Yeah, it reminds me of certain coverage in the Italian press of immigrants being washed ashore on Lampedusa, and photographers with very long lenses taking pictures of people sunbathing with, these migrants who are
coming out and
so we should just leave Lampedusa to become a sort of prison island and
nothing more.
And nothing more. I mean, it's not an easy debate, but it's often presented in terms which are too simplistic, I think.
These things do have to be argued out. But I think to say no, we shouldn't have tourism because something else is happening is not an answer.
What do you think has changed since the years when, I suppose if you could identify a time which was a sort of high watermark for printed guidebooks, certainly in English, it would be from the mid-70s through to probably the end of the 90s when Lonely Planet, Rough Guides, Time Out, sort of Fodor's, I suppose, and Frommer's, which have been going for a while in the States, and Rick Steves as well in the States. Dominated.
And Guy de Routard in France, of course.
Oh, and Guy de Routard, yeah, as well. Had a very dominant position. You would go into bookshops and see shelves and shelves and shelves. You still do, but things have... print is losing out, isn't it?
Print's losing out. I think, today, any sort of media at all, you have to accept that there are huge changes. I went to Richard Gingrass's talk about Google yesterday, and he was talking about when he started in television in the States back in whenever it was he started in it. How old is he? And he's in the late 60s or early 70s. There were 4 television stations in America. If you were on one of them, you knew you had 3 competitors. Now you have 300 or 3,000 or 30,000. Everybody's making... There was a wonderful article I read last week about how, of all the television countries in Europe, that the Germans put more money into broadcasting and they have less viewers for it. And that all the young people are all watching everything on YouTube. Rather than watch German free-to-air television, you watch YouTube, things on YouTube, and everybody's their own television broadcaster. And so it's happening in television, it's happening in magazines, newspapers, and guidebooks.
And presumably what's taking place is it's not just obviously the competition between print guidebooks, which was always there, but it is the fact that people aren't taking print with them at all. They're going with their mobile phones, with their iPads. They're using TripAdvisor to find hotels and restaurants. They're maybe sort of downloading bits and pieces from guidebooks or online guidebooks and using and sort of comparing and contrasting them.
And you have to, if you are producing a guidebook or any other media today, you have to think, how am I doing this? And how am I going to sell it? And where's the money going to come from? And it's coming from different places than it used to do.
I mean, Lonely Planet was one of the first to pick up on the new digital trends and, for example, launched the Thorn Tree, which was...
back in the early 90s.
In the early 90s, which, I mean, can you just explain maybe to people who don't know what Thorn Tree is?
You know, we almost need to look back at when the internet really started, because the internet as something that we used as a sort of consumer thing, not just military it started as, or academic, was really a 93, 94, 95, around that time. So it's only really 20 years old. And yet it feels like it's been there forever. You know, you'd sort of tell your kids, you know, that you can remember before the internet. What are you, not you that old? You're not 100 years old yet, are you? But you know, it wasn't there. And of course, that digital side has changed things enormously. And the Thorn Tree was early social media. It was an area on the Lonely Planet website where people could pose a question and someone would immediately come up with an answer. And I used the Thorn Tree a lot when I was writing Darklands, Fiori Rota, particularly in the Congo, because the Congo is an area where there are not many tourists are going to. And yet, there were any tourists who had gone there from the Congo, really wanted to tell the world about it. So, if anybody put a question up, you know, I'd like to find out about boats going up or down the Congo River between Kinshasa and Kisangani. Sure enough, there'd be somebody who'd done it last month, and you know, that just amazes me that there are these adventurous souls who do these things. One of the other trips I did writing this book, I wanted to go to New Guinea. Which is, you know, a troubled place. It's been described as a country, the parliament of 1,000 tribes, because it's got probably half the languages in the world are spoken in New Guinea. There are so many different languages, and a small village will speak an entirely different language to another. But also they had this civil war through the 90s on one particular island, which tore this island apart, and yet the outside world never seemed to notice it was going on. And I wanted to go there, and I decided what I wanted to do was go up to that island through the Solomon Islands, where all the arms used to come to for one side of this civil war. So I did go up through the Solomon Islands, and I stayed at this little church mission, and I was the first person to stay at this mission in 3 months. And yet that was on Thorn Tree. There were various people who'd said, if you go there, stay there. And it was a really nice trip, because then I hitched a ride with a little boat from the local village across to the main island of New Guinea. And of course, when I arrived there, I was arriving by a totally unofficial, illegal method, but there was no immigration office to stamp my passport. And I was told that if you did this, the best thing to do was to go around to a police station and say, look, I'm really sorry, but I've just turned up in your country. I know what I've done is illegal. You know, what do I do? And sure enough, I did that. I went to the police station, and they said, oh, you naughty boy, you shouldn't have done this. Give us your passport, we'll stamp it for you. So I've got, in my passport, I've got stamped, reported to police station. And they said, well, when you get to it, well, a week later, I found a place with an immigration office, and I went in and said, look, I'm sorry, I've been in the country for a week, and I haven't really arrived yet, but I did report to the police station. And they said, oh, okay. Great. It's wonderful, you know, in the world now, in 2000, and this was last year, 2013, you can still turn up in countries illegally and go around to the police station and get stamped in.
Sure, sure. And let's come around to the book now, because that's a nice way into it. This is, I suppose, you could define it as part 2 of a project which you began with a book called Badlands, which was published in 2007, which was the same year that you and Maureen sold Lonely Planet to BBC Worldwide. Obviously, the preparation for the book was previous to that, but Badlands was inspired, if you like, was a reaction to the whole idea of the axis of evil. I mean, if you remember George Bush's infamous speech, State of the Union speech, I think in 2002, when he named Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as part of an axis of evil. And immediately that made you think, I want to go there.
Absolutely. I mean, who wouldn't? If you have the president saying, here's a travel challenge, guys. You know, there are 3 countries that are so bad that I, as the president, have defined them as an axis of evil. Well, lots of people would think, oh, I want to see those. I mean, he did more for tourism to North Korea than any previous American president, I'm sure. And Iraq, for that matter.
And in that first book, you then added in a few more, which
bad countries.
Bad countries: Afghanistan, Burma, Cuba, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Albania.
Albania really hardly deserved it, but poor little Albania, I just kind of felt sorry for it. I mean, how many countries can you go where you fly into the national airport and it's named after a nun? You know, you fly into the Mother Teresa International Airport. I love that. That's a good country.
I remember my only experience of Albania was going on a day trip from Corfu to see Roman ruins in a place called Butrint, which are beautiful ruins, and being excavated by a team from the University of Birmingham in England. But on the roads in Albania are terrible. And just before you get to this Roman site, there's about 3 kilometers of beautifully asphalted roads which have been done with foreign money. And apparently Albanians with big Mercedes drive there to drive up and down this 3 kilometre stretch. So that's my Albanian experience. Your Furirota Darklands is, I suppose you could say, a sequel, if you like, to Badlands, in that I suppose if you could talk about those first group of countries as the Premier League, this is kind of second division or championship or whatever. You visited in this book Colombia, Congo, Haiti, Israel and Palestine, Nauru, which is a little island in the Pacific, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, and Zimbabwe. What do they have in common?
Well, they all have problems. I think that was the definition. And, you know, in a way they were sort of second league. People hadn't defined them as bad the way they defined the first lot. Even, I've just been in Cuba again, and I put Cuba in the first book, but the Americans have been saying Cuba's bad for 50 years. And, you know, if Fidel is still alive when Obama goes and Hillary Clinton or whoever comes in, I think Fidel's going to be facing his 14th American president. 14 presidents all saying Cuba's bad, you should get rid of Fidel. And Fidel has just stuck around and he's got rid of president after president after president. So Cuba was definitely an interesting place to define as a bad land. But these other countries, they were all really interesting in various fashions. And 1 or 2 of them I would really, if I'd had more time, I'd have put them in the first one. I think the Congo, in some ways, was the most interesting country in the whole lot, because it's such a big country, and it's got so much going for it. And I compared it with Brazil. Brazil is another big country with lots of resources and lots of possibilities. And essentially, Brazil works. It's about to have the Football World Cup and then the Olympics.
And in certain, although it has a huge poverty gap, it's booming in some respects. I mean, it's been defined as one of the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China.
Brazil, you know, it's far from perfect, but it's not bad. Whereas Congo is bad, and it's been, you know, bad from the start. It's had so many problems, and again, it's had this huge war, the World War of Africa, essentially, that went on through the 90s and into this century, which again we hardly noticed.
And is it a coincidence that the war in Bougainville and the war in the Congo, if you dig deep, I mean, it's all to do with mining, isn't it? It's all to do with resources.
Mining is a bad thing. And, you know, I say we all carry around a little bit of the Congo because we've all got a phone in our pocket. And the very important mineral that goes into every mobile phone generally comes from the Congo. The Congo is the main source of tantalum, this important mineral. And, you know, people fight over it. It's like there's conflict diamonds, well, there's conflict phones.
Actually, that to me is one of the very interesting themes of the book, that we're surrounded, and we're living in a globalized world. We source, you know, bananas from Central America and
drugs from everywhere.
Drugs from
Colombia.
Colombia is one example you give here. Nauru, this little Pacific island, was basically was built on bird shit. In other words, it had huge phosphate deposits which had taken thousands and thousands of years to build up, and maybe about 20 years
a very short period of time to spend it all.
Completely deplete.
We should add as well that now you talked about Lampedusa earlier, and if Lampedusa to Italy, and Nauru is a little bit like that to Australia. It's where a lot of refugees end up who are trying to make their way to Australia by sea.
And it's where the problems are pushed away to.
So it's a little bit, it's Australia's Guantanamo Bay as well. It's got a lot of bad things about it.
I think, in a way, there's a sense in which traveling to these places is a way of, tell me if you think this is fanciful, but it's a way of taking responsibility. You know, you're tracing back something.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I didn't know, for example, is that until recently, I don't think it's true anymore, but baseballs used to be made in Haiti. The actual balls themselves.
That's right. They sewed them up there. Haiti had quite a few little local industries until everything went disastrously wrong.
I mean, I've always thought that it would be fascinating to take a regular day in the life of an ordinary Westerner, and at the end of the day, tot up the places that you had. All the things that you'd used and eaten and worn, and have to then visit all of those countries. There would probably be something like, I don't know, 100, 150? Yeah. I mean,
we carry today so much around with us that comes from, a lot of it from China, of course, these days. And it is really interesting to trace back where these things come from. Actually, apart from the other country for sporting equipment is Pakistan, where cricket balls are made, despite all the problems in Pakistan. It's amazing. What cricket, the other thing that intrigues me with cricket at the moment is Afghanistan has become a major cricket playing center. And it's because of all the young Afghan guys who were in refugee camps in Pakistan and learned to play cricket in Pakistan and apply sort of warlike tendencies to the sport. And as a result, they've become a very good cricket team and are going to be in an international cricket championship in Australia later.
You know, the Vatican has a cricket team as well.
Does it really? I'm sure I'd like to see the Pope out
all
there.
The Indian cardinals and Australian priests and
I'm sure that happens. It's a very international sport. After football, it's probably the most international in the world.
Do you think, Tony, that there's an extent to which, after years and years of traveling and writing travel guides and being a travel writer, you need these challenges to keep things interesting, in that you become a little bit jaded and you need more and more extreme countries to go to?
A little bit. I mean, from the very start with Lonely Planet, the thing that started Lonely Planet off was doing books to countries that other people weren't doing. That if you took a Blue Guide or a Michelin Guide or whatever, you could find a guide to France or Britain or Italy or wherever, but if you wanted to go to Pakistan or Thailand or Burma, there was nothing. So Lonely Planet did fill those odd gaps in at the start. And I've always loved that element of it. I've always been pleased when Lonely Planet's done the odd and unusual guides, and I really do hope that the Lonely Planet that continues on without me at the controls will we'll continue to do that, because it's been the most interesting part about it, I think. And personally, I mean, I love comfortable travel. I love being in Perugia and the other comfortable countries I go to all the time. But it is more interesting in many ways going to these unusual, and more unusual things happen to you in unusual places. And of course, you don't meet so many other travelers. And if any time you think there's too many tourists, you need to go to a place where only one tourist a month turns up. And there's lots of those in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, and again, this is a country which, compared to North Korea, perhaps, or Iraq, is a relatively visitable and relatively safe, which is Lebanon, which is a fantastic country to visit. I mean, Beirut is an amazing city, and I remember going up to Baalbek, which is one of the great classical sites of the Middle East, and seeing about 2 other tourists there, and all the hotels being empty, and just because it's, I mean, these days, I don't know if you can even travel to Baalbek because it's very close to the border with Syria. But at the time, about 10 years ago, it was just fantastic. And you have such a, as you say, a much more rewarding experience because people also generally tend to be much more welcoming because they're so grateful.
Yeah, well, that was certainly the question, the way all through the time when it was politically unacceptable to go to Burma. The Burmese loved to see you. You know, the red carpet was rolled out for every visitor there. And I had so many great experiences in Burma because of that, because they just weren't visitors there. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for countries that don't get visitors regularly.
That said, you did have a few risky experiences. You got stoned in
I think
Israel and Palestine.
I didn't get stoned in Colombia where all the drugs are. No, I got stoned with real stones in Palestine. And I was mistaken for an Israeli at one point. And I pretty quickly realized what was happening. That they thought I was an Israeli from a settlement I could see over there in the background. And I sort of got my passport out and waved it at them. It's not an Israeli passport. But in a way, if you go to Palestine and you don't get a stone tossed at you, you really have.
You feel cheated.
You feel cheated, yeah. I remember once, I've never been to the Yemen, and the Yemen perhaps could have been in this, and it's always been a country that's fascinated me. And I was at a talk I think it was in Australia, where people were talking about the Yemen, and somebody in the audience put their hand up and said, yeah, but when I went to the Yemen last month, I was kidnapped for 3 days. And another woman, there was a woman, and the woman on the other side said, oh, I was kidnapped as well. And it was almost like if you went to the Yemen and you weren't kidnapped, you felt cheated. You didn't have the real, I went to Italy and I never ate spaghetti. I went to the Yemen and I didn't get kidnapped. What's wrong? Why didn't anybody kidnap me? Well, I had that. I got.
It's like sailing in a yacht off Somalia. You expect to get hijacked by pirates.
That's right. And I didn't see any pirates. So why not? Yeah. So I got stoned in Palestine, and I got arrested once in the Congo. And you get arrested mainly because they or the police think they can get some money from you, and either you pay a little bit of money or you talk a lot. And I ended up talking a lot and didn't pay any money to them.
And you timed your arrival in Pakistan quite well as well, didn't you?
A wonderful time. We arrived there just as there was that movie made a year or so ago that had come out in English and got no publicity at all, and then they decided to translate it into Arabic and put some of it up on YouTube, and immediately there was this.
It was the famous film about it's called The Innocence of Muslims, wasn't it? And it was basically provoked riots all across the Arab world.
And it
seemed to be offensive to the Prophet.
Yeah. And it just sort of started off, and it sort of lulled along a little bit as I arrived in Pakistan, and then it really took off. And I was in Islamabad, and the hotel I was staying at was the one that most foreigners stayed at. And I left it, and the next day, the Pakistan government gave the whole country a national holiday so they could express their love for the Prophet. And the hint seemed to be, go to your nearest American embassy, and throw stones at it, or American consulate or whatever. Or if you can't find that, if you can find a Kentucky Fried Chicken, burn it down. So that was how a lot of Pakistanis decided to express their love for the Prophet.
Including the hotel that you just been staying in.
Including the hotel I'd just stayed in. So if I hadn't left the day before, I would have been trapped in the hotel until for a day or two, till the whole thing was over.
You had a close shave in the Congo as well, just in terms of a plane that you took.
We'll get back to that, but let me just have a few more minutes in Pakistan first, because we then, Maureen and I left, as Maureen, my wife, was with me for this trip. We left and we were traveling up the Karakoram Highway into China, and this protest was going on, and we were stopped at one point because we heard that the road was closed up ahead by protesters. And it seemed like every little town we came to, we'd go to whichever hotel we were going to stay in, and we'd come into the hotel, and everybody was crowded around the television. And on the television, there was riots and rocks throwing and little fires coming up and people holding up signs saying, "Death to Americans." And then they'd turn around and see the first tourists coming in they'd seen in months. And, it was "Death to America," and then, "Oh, tourists, come in. Would you like some tea?" So what was happening on television? Complete flip, complete separation. My experience, the one I always say, people say the two questions that as a travel writer you hate to be asked. One is, what is your favorite country, or what's your favorite town? And
what's your favorite country?
Oh, well, Italy. I love Italy. Every time I come back here, I'm so happy, and probably Perugia is my favorite town, closely followed by Rome and Milan and Venice and wherever. So yeah, that's the question you had. The next worst question is, what's the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to you? And the most dangerous thing always happens behind your back, or you get out of the taxi and, God, that taxi driver was crazy, and then he has an accident after he's dropped you off, or the bomb goes off around the corner or whatever. But I did several flights while I was in Congo, and one of them I did with an airline called Huabora. And I got on this Boeing 727, and I'm one of those airline geeks who, on Boeing aircraft, as you get on the plane, if you look above the door, you can see a little "Made in Seattle" thing with the year the aircraft was made. And, if you're sort of waiting for people to put their baggage up, you can always check how old the plane is that you've just got on. Well, this one was 48 or 49 years old. It had been flying for quite a while.
Which is kind of old for an aeroplane.
But it looked pretty well maintained. They put the little winglets on the end. Lufthansa had it for many years. And I flew from Kinshasa, the capital, to Kisangani on this aircraft, and I hung around for a few days. And then I did a second flight on it to the town right on the border with Rwanda, where a lot of the trouble has been.
Goma, is that right?
Goma. Yeah. And then I left, and I just walked across the border into Rwanda and went onto Nairobi and flew back to London. And a week after I'd done this, I opened the newspaper in England, and it says air crash in the Congo. And it was the same air. It was the only 727 they had. So it was obviously that was the one. And exactly 7 days after I'd flown on it, it went down into the jungle. So, the most dangerous thing, if I'd taken the flight a week later, I wouldn't be here today.
Do you think there's an extent to which, going to supposedly dangerous or difficult countries, I think this often happens with travel. As soon as you get there, the danger and difficulty starts to evaporate, and you realize that really it's just about people and people making a living. And
it's never as bad as you think it's going to be. And you always get to a place, and at first, you've been told all these bad things about it, and you sort of step out of your hotel looking in both directions and looking over your shoulder, and then after a day or two, you get more relaxed. Still, lots of places you need to be cautious. But
it's all relative, isn't it? I remember during the war in Bosnia, the American tourism to Italy dipped.
Stopped, yeah.
Because, well, not stopped, but there was a definite decrease in the numbers. Because from an American perspective, Bosnia is just across the water. It's like, it's kind of...
Well, I mean, there's some places, as soon as anything goes wrong, people stop going there, even though it's the other side of the world from where the trouble is. And maybe it's a really good time to go there because security is going to be so much higher and so on. But as you say, things are never as bad as they say. I traveled for Badlands. I traveled around Afghanistan. And I had I'd been to Afghanistan back in the 70s when Afghanistan was fine. But I went back there a few years ago, and Afghanistan for me, was fine. But I had a driver in a car, and my driver was very careful. He was a lot more cautious than I was. He watched over me, and on one occasion we'd gone to Herat over near the border of Iran, and then we were driving into central Afghanistan, and he'd rented a car to do this. He didn't have his own car there. And we got this car, and we drove around Herat that day. And then next morning when we set off, it wasn't the same car. And I said, Mobin, why have we got a different car today? And he said, that car looked too good. I wanted a car that was a bit more beat up and a few more scratches on it and dents. And that, the one we've got now, look what a wreck it is. It's a good thing to have, nice wrecked car.
Okay, I think maybe we could start to throw the discussion open to the floor. Dunque, se qualcuno ha qualche domanda per Tony su Lonely Planet, sul libro, su quello che abbiamo detto finora, benvenga. Any questions are very welcome.
Anything? Yes.
Yep. Wait a minute, the microphone is coming.
Hello. Is there a Chinese Lonely Planet not related to your Lonely Planet?
There's a Chinese Lonely Planet in both directions. There's a Lonely Planet guide in English and Italian and other languages to China. And I often think it's one of Lonely Planet's best guides because China is such a challenge that, we're, most of us, illiterate when we're there. We can't even read the signs and so on. So and I've used it a lot. It's a very good guidebook. But also there are guidebooks to other parts of the world in Chinese. And one of the first guides that the Lonely Planet China put out, the partners of Lonely Planet in China, was to Italy, because so many Chinese wanted to come to Italy, and the idea of, and I love it. I've got a copy of that book. You can look up Perugia in it, and read about the restaurants in Perugia in Chinese. I don't know how many Chinese we see here yet, but young Chinese, there's just an enthusiasm and an energy amongst young Chinese, and in particular. And they want to see the world. It's they want to have a car and a motorcycle and all the things that they couldn't have in many years. But also seeing the world is just a major attraction. And it's going to make tourism more difficult because there's going to be lots of them. But they're starting. At first, like many places, they're starting doing package tours and all of Europe in 21 days. Is the thing. But Chinese are starting to travel independently, and we'll see a lot more of that. One of the best accounts I've read of tourism recently was written by an American journalist who speaks Chinese, speaks Mandarin, and he joined a Chinese package tour to Europe, and it was a see all of Europe in 21 days. And at the very start, they were sort of told, these are some of the problems you're going to encounter when you're traveling around Europe, and one of them was that Europeans are really slow. They just can't, you go into a shop in China and, we'll take your order and we'll get this off the shelf and we'll make change for you. You'll just find that Europeans can only do one thing at a time. And you're just going to have to join the queue and go slowly and accept that. Just don't try and push the envelope. It was a very nice account of what a different perspective on our travel.
The question was not properly phrased, maybe you didn't get. The question is that Lonely Planet in China run by the Lonely Planet organization, or is it a Chinese endeavor?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, all the publishing houses are one of the things that is always run by the government in China. But we've actually had 2 bites at I keep saying we, even though I'm not involved with Lonely Planet. I don't own Lonely Planet anymore. Despite which I went to China twice last year and met with the Chinese publishers there. We first of all did it with a Chinese government publisher, and it worked very well for a while, and then, like many things in China, somebody new came in and they went off in a totally different path and didn't want to do guidebooks anymore. And we set up another operation where essentially Lonely Planet set it up, and we took a lot of the staff from the original operation, and it was completely set up by Lonely Planet. But at the end of the day, the books have to be published by a Chinese government operation. And then, this question of censorship. I mean, the first thing that always pops up in anything on China is that you cannot mention the 3 T's: Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen Square. As soon as you say those, you're in trouble. But they push the envelope. They do try and, get things through. And I've been very impressed with what they've done. And one of the things Lonely Planet's done in China is they've done a series of regional guides to each area of China, which have never been produced in English, Italian, or European language. They've only been produced in Chinese. And they were written by Chinese travel writers. But at the start, the Chinese travel writers had no experience of going out and, assessing hotels and restaurants and finding the information that was needed. So Lonely Planet put in European or American or British or Australian travel writers who spoke Chinese to work with the Chinese writers to show them how to do it. And then, having sort of trained them for a couple of weeks, said, off you go. And they produced this series of 8 regional guidebooks to China for Chinese travelers in Chinese, which have never been done. They're under translation. They're Chinese guidebooks.
Are they selling well?
They're selling very well, yeah. And that's fantastic. I love the idea of young Chinese traveling around China with a Chinese Lonely Planet guidebook.
And also, presumably, that's a territory where print still
works, yeah.
Works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions?
This is wide questions to both of you. I'm fan of Lonely Planet, you Stone Tree, but times are changing. How do you see the future of travel writing with the digital revolution, multimedia? Do you still think the books will be there?
I think there's room for both, and I mean I've got back at the hotel. I've got my iPad with a dozen or so Lonely Planet guidebooks on it, and I still travel with the paper guidebooks as well, but increasingly I travel with them as PDF downloads rather than the paper version. It really depends where I'm going. If I was going to be in Italy for the next month driving around, I'd want the paper book. But I'm only in Italy this trip for 3 or 4 days, and I don't want to carry the big Italy book with me, so I've got it. It is more convenient as a book, I still find, than as an electronic source of information. And, so often, I always say the batteries never go flat on your book. You never have trouble getting an internet connection. It works all the time. You turn the pages, and there it is. You shut it down, and it turns off.
I still love paper books, and again, as with you, it depends on how long you're going for, and whether you have a guide to the whole of Italy and you're just going to, I don't know, Ferrara, and do you tear out the 2 pages about Ferrara, or do you just kind of photocopy them, which I sometimes do. I do quite a lot of photocopying of guides, and I especially like still using paper maps. I think we're losing the ability to navigate in the era of Google Maps. And I'm still a great believer in maps on paper.
And Google Maps, I found this quite a few times writing Darklands, how often Google Maps, they're wrong, or they just don't cover things. That they cover things, if you're in Perugia, they'll cover every little street and alley and so on. You get to the Solomon Islands, and there's this whole island that hasn't even got a name to it. And I found also when I was in Israel that the Israelis have a deal with the American government that Google Earth can't show anything in Israel to any sort of resolution at all. And they've
basically very low res.
Yeah, it's very, very. I walked along a bit of the dividing wall between Israel and Palestine, the West Bank, Palestine, and I went back to my hotel to look at what it looked like on Google Earth, and you just couldn't see it. It was just fuzzy.
I did an interview recently with a mountain rescue team leader who said that the number of people calling out mountain rescue has doubled or tripled in many cases because people are just going with their phones, assuming that the phone will somehow get them down to the other end of across the mountain and down the other side. And if it doesn't, they can always
phone and rescue me, yeah.
Which we never would have, nobody would have thought of doing 10, 15 years ago.
No.
You go properly with a proper map, with a compass, so you know where
it is amazing. Other question.
Other questions? Okay, I think we've pretty much run out of time there. So thank you very much. Let me just repeat again, Tony Wheeler, Fuori Rotta, really worth reading together with the previous book, Badlands. Absolutely fascinating mosaic of, and also a book that really renews your faith in travel and why we travel, I think. So thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
May fail to grasp just what a revolution guidebooks like Lonely Planet were when they came in, because if at the time, I mean, the guidebook market had been dominated for over a century, in fact, by very traditional guides like Baedekers and the blue guides, and the kind of
Michelin
guide,
as well.
Michelin, the kind of guide either that tells you how many rooms this hotel has and and gives stars to restaurants, or the kind of guide that tells you what painting you can see in the third altar on the left. I mean, Lonely Planet wasn't the very first. I mean, Let's Go guides, the Harvard University student guide, started in the early 60s, and I suppose one of the very first of this kind of guide was the South America Handbook, which goes right back to the 20s. And
yeah, so there were things, and I remember years later when we did our first India guide, and a book I had was called Murray's Handbook to India, which had come out, first of all, in 1890 or something, in 3 volumes. It was 3 big books. And then it had been out of print, and the new edition came out every 20 years. So it wasn't exactly kept up to date. And it was a wonderful book to travel around India with, because it was so old-fashioned. It was sort of, you get to the hotel, and the first thing you ask is, get your servant to unpack the trunks. And I always feel...
Welcome to this conversation with Tony Wheeler. I wanted to start by presenting Tony in a general way, and maybe chatting a little bit about Lonely Planet in the early days and your approach to travel writing, and then we'll move into the presentation of Tony's new book, Dark Lands, in Italiano, Fuori Rotta, che è uscito in italiano questi giorni da pochissimo. And then we'll, I'll open up. I'll try and leave at least 10 minutes at the end to open up for questions if you have any questions. Okay. And I want to bring you in, Tony, as much as possible. I don't want to sort of talk for hours. So even at the beginning, let's make it back and forth. Tony Wheeler is probably best known as the co-founder with his wife Maureen of the travel guides, the Lonely Planet travel guide series, which began in the early 70s, following a trip.
The first thing you should do when you get to a hotel, once you've got your room, is to unpack your trunk. What else does one do?
Of course. And in fact, one of the very first editions of the South America Handbook, one of the pieces of advice there was pack a good saddle and a set of starched collars.
Well, so I think the South American Handbook used to recommend which countries in South America it was a good idea to carry your pistol. The arms are necessary in this country, but it's okay in that one. You don't need to be armed.
Well, maybe a good piece of advice today as well in some countries.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about, there's an ongoing debate, and as a travel writer, I think often it can be a rather what's the word? A rather artificial debate about guidebooks and the way they can ruin the places that they write about by bringing people into these beautiful, untouched paradises and sort of. What's your answer to that?
Well, I've been asked this question quite often.
Me too.
Yeah. Bali was beautiful until you did a guidebook to it, and look what's happened to it now. As if I built the airport and I bought the Airbuses and the Boeing whatevers, and I made all those hotels down the beach.
Cross overland from London. In the end, to Australia, I suppose, which was supposed to be a gap year at the beginning.
It was, yeah. It was 1 year off, which somehow stretched to 40 years.
I did exactly the same, actually, when I arrived in Italy in 1984. It was supposed to be a 6-month holiday, and 30 years later, here we are. You actually had a background of traveling even in your childhood and when you were growing up, didn't you? Because your dad worked for an airline?
Yeah, my father was working for what at that time was BOAC, later became British Airways. And as a result, I did my early schooling in Pakistan and the Bahamas. And then high school, I did all of it in America. So I didn't, although I was born in Britain, I didn't really live in Britain until I was 16. And that might have given me an enthusiasm for travel. On the other hand, I had a younger brother and a younger sister, and it didn't give them an enthusiasm for travel at all. Maybe it put them off it.
When you set out on that trip in 1972 across, it was, I suppose, the classic hippie trail, wasn't it, at the time? Although maybe it was more of an extreme version of it, because the hippie trail often got bogged down somewhere in Turkey, and then you got the magic bus back to London. But did you have any idea that would turn into what has become a 40-year
trip? No, well, of course, we didn't call it the hippie trail in those days. I think it was only really called the hippie trail afterwards. And there's more to be written and, photographs to be searched out and so on, because it was a very colorful period. We called it the Asia Overland trip at the time, the idea of getting to Asia without taking a flight anywhere. But we had no idea it was going to turn into what it did. No, it was a complete surprise to us. And that first Lonely Planet book was not anything that was planned in any way at all. It just happened.
But was there a certain point of the trip when you started taking notes, thinking?
I'd sort of been taking notes from the very start. And, you did a lot of, because there weren't all the guidebooks in those days, there was a lot of note swapping between other people you met. So you met someone coming the other way, and you were just about to cross from Turkey into Iran, and they'd just come from Tehran to Tabriz to Turkey, and you were telling them where you'd stayed, and they were telling you where they had stayed.
It was kind of the equivalent at the time of a social network, wasn't it?
It was very much social network.
Sort of TripAdvisor on the road.
Yeah, except we didn't have any computers or phones or credit cards or anything else that we have today.
I think it's maybe younger generations